Abraham Lincoln did not die simply because one angry actor entered a theater with a pistol. He died at the end of a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple targets, an underground network of Confederate sympathizers, a missing presidential guard, a carefully prepared escape route, and a security system so weak that the assassin could walk directly into the president's private box. The most shocking part is not that John Wilkes Booth succeeded. It is how many opportunities existed to stop him. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Washington was celebrating. The Civil War was almost over. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered only 5 days earlier, and many Americans believed the nightmare of rebellion, bloodshed, and division had finally ended. President Abraham Lincoln went to Ford's Theater expecting a few peaceful hours of entertainment. Before the night was over, Lincoln would be unconscious. His assassin would be fleeing through the darkness, and other members of the government would be fighting for their lives. For generations, the story has often been reduced to one sentence. John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln during a play. But that simple sentence hides a much darker truth. Lincoln's murder was not originally Booth's first plan. It was part of a wider operation. Booth was not acting completely alone. The attack exposed catastrophic security failures, and some details that Americans commonly accept, including exactly how Booth injured his leg, remain disputed. Recent medical research has also allowed specialists to reconsider the path of the bullet through Lincoln's skull, revealing more clearly why the president never regained consciousness and why no 19th-century treatment could have saved him. This is the untold story behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. What is proven, what remains uncertain, and what sensational conspiracy theories still fail to explain. Abraham Lincoln was no stranger to death threats. By 1865, the United States had endured 4 years of civil war. Lincoln had become the most hated man in the Confederacy, and a symbol of emancipation to millions of formerly enslaved people. Enemies accused him of destroying the South, expanding federal authority, and overturning the racial order on which slavery had depended. Yet presidential protection in 19th-century America was extraordinarily weak by modern standards. There was no permanent protective service surrounding the president. The United States Secret Service was created on the day Lincoln was assassinated, but its original mission was to combat counterfeiting, not to protect presidents. Continuous presidential protection did not become standard until after William McKinley's assassination in 1901. Lincoln often walked, rode, and attended public events with minimal protection. This relaxed system had survived partly because Americans still viewed the presidency as an accessible Republican office rather than an institution requiring military-style security. But Lincoln's circumstances were anything but normal. He was leading a divided nation through a war marked by espionage, guerrilla activity, assassination threats, and Confederate operations beyond the battlefield. The danger was real. Years earlier, Lincoln had secretly changed his route to Washington after detectives warned of a possible assassination plot in Baltimore before his first inauguration. By 1865, he had survived the war. He would not survive the peace. John Wilkes Booth was handsome, charismatic, and famous. He came from a celebrated theatrical family and was known across the country. His status gave him something most assassins do not possess: access. Ford's Theater employees knew him. Washington society recognized him. His presence near a theater box would not automatically cause alarm, but behind his public image was an intense commitment to the Confederacy and white supremacy. Booth despised Lincoln's policies, particularly emancipation and the possibility of political rights for Black Americans. On April 11, 1865, Booth listened as Lincoln delivered a speech from the White House discussing Reconstruction and limited voting rights for some Black men, especially educated men and Black veterans. According to testimony later associated with Booth's companion Louis Weichman, Booth reacted with fury and declared that it would be Lincoln's final speech. 3 nights later, Lincoln was shot. The timing reveals something important. Booth's decision was not merely the impulsive rage of an unstable celebrity. It developed from a political cause and from plans he had already been constructing for months. Recent historical interpretations continue to place Booth within the broader world of Confederate clandestine activity and Southern sympathizer networks, rather than treating him as a man who suddenly acted in total isolation. That broader context does not prove that the Confederate government directly ordered Lincoln's murder, but it makes the lone madman version deeply misleading. Booth did not begin with a plan to murder Lincoln. His original objective was to kidnap the president. The idea was to seize Lincoln, transport him into Confederate territory, and exchange him for Confederate prisoners held by the Union. Booth recruited men who could provide weapons, horses, knowledge of Maryland's roads, and safe places to hide.
Among those connected to his operations were David Harold, who knew the countryside, Lewis Powell, a former Confederate soldier, George Atzerodt, familiar with boats and routes across the Potomac, Samuel Arnold, and Michael O'Laughlin, who had Confederate ties, John Surratt, a Confederate courier, and Mary Surratt, whose boarding house became an important meeting location.
On March 17, 1865, Booth's group prepared to intercept Lincoln while the president was expected to travel to a military hospital. Lincoln changed his plans, and the kidnapping attempt collapsed before it began. The Library of Congress timeline identifies that failed operation as an important moment in Booth's movement toward assassination. Then the Confederacy began to collapse. Richmond fell. Lee surrendered. The prisoner exchange fantasy became almost meaningless. Booth's objective changed from capturing Lincoln to destroying the Union government's leadership. That change is central to understanding the assassination. This was not just a personal revenge attack. It became an attempted decapitation strike. Most people know Booth planned to kill Lincoln. Far fewer realize that Lincoln was only one target. Booth's conspiracy called for nearly simultaneous attacks against 3 senior government leaders: President Abraham Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward. Booth assigned George Atzerodt to kill Johnson at the Kirkwood House Hotel. Lewis Powell was assigned to murder Seward, who was recovering at home from a serious carriage accident. Booth would personally attack Lincoln. The strategy was terrifyingly clear.
If the president, vice president, and secretary of state were killed on the same night, the United States government could be thrown into confusion, just as it attempted to reunify the country. Atzerodt lost his nerve and never attacked Johnson.
Powell did attack Seward. Using the excuse that he was delivering medicine, Powell entered Seward's home and fought his way upstairs. He stabbed the Secretary of State repeatedly and injured several others who tried to stop him. Seward survived partly because a metal and canvas brace supporting his broken jaw may have protected him from a fatal wound. Only Booth completed his assigned murder. This proves that Lincoln's assassination was not a spontaneous act by a lone individual. It formed part of a coordinated operation involving several conspirators. The Library of Congress and National Park Service both describe Booth's network and the related attacks. The famous image of Booth acting alone therefore hides the scale of the attempted political attack. April 14 was Good Friday. Lincoln had spent part of the day conducting government business, discussing Reconstruction and meeting visitors. That evening, he and Mary Lincoln planned to attend Our American Cousin, a popular comedy, at Ford's Theater. General Ulysses S. Grant and his wife had originally been expected to join them, but declined and left Washington. Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, attended instead. The theater publicly advertised Lincoln's planned appearance. That announcement increased ticket sales and told Booth precisely where the president would be. Booth learned during the day that Lincoln was coming. As a familiar actor with access to Ford's Theater, he understood the building, the backstage areas, and the rhythm of the performance. He also knew the play well enough to select a moment when loud audience laughter would help conceal the pistol shot. This was not simply luck. Booth used professional knowledge gained from the theater. The murder was, in a chilling sense, staged like a performance. One of the most troubling elements of the assassination concerns John Frederick Parker, the Washington police officer assigned to accompany Lincoln. Parker escorted the presidential party to Ford's Theater, but his whereabouts at the exact moment of the shooting are unknown. A popular version says he abandoned his post during intermission and went to drink at the Star Saloon next door. The National Park Service states that there is some evidence Parker may have visited the saloon with Lincoln's coachman and messenger. However, there is no definitive evidence establishing where Parker remained when Booth fired. This distinction matters. It is fair to say Parker was not guarding the entrance when Booth attacked. It is not fair to claim every detail of his movements is proven. Parker was later charged with neglect of duty, but the charges were dismissed. The hearing transcript has not survived, and Parker was never called to testify at the conspiracy trial. The truly shocking truth is larger than one allegedly irresponsible officer. The system itself was dangerously informal. Lincoln did not normally have a guard continuously positioned outside his theater box. 19th-century presidential protection operated according to expectations that seem almost unimaginable today. The assassin did not defeat a sophisticated security team. There was scarcely a security team to defeat. At approximately 10:15 p.m., Booth approached the president's box. Because he was famous and familiar at the theater, he did not appear suspicious. He passed through the outer door and entered the narrow passage leading to the box. Evidence from the scene indicated that the door could be secured from inside using a wooden bar fitted into a prepared notch. This would delay anyone trying to reach Lincoln after the attack. Booth then looked through an opening in the inner door, or otherwise observed the president's position. Lincoln was seated in a rocking chair, facing the stage. The audience was laughing at one of the play's best-known lines. Booth stepped forward, raised a single-shot .44 caliber Derringer, and fired into the back left area of Lincoln's head. Lincoln immediately lost consciousness. He never woke again. Major Rathbone attempted to seize Booth. Booth slashed him deeply with a knife, climbed onto the front of the box and jumped toward the stage. His spur reportedly caught on part of the decorative material, or a framed image, as he fell. He landed awkwardly, raised his knife, and shouted words that witnesses remembered differently. The most famous version is, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the state motto of Virginia. Some witnesses also heard a declaration for the South. Booth crossed the stage, escaped through the rear of the theater, and mounted a waiting horse. The assassination had taken seconds. Its consequences would last generations. The familiar story says Booth broke his left leg when he jumped from Lincoln's box. That may be true, but it is not entirely settled. Booth later wrote that he broke his leg during the leap. The theatrical fall, the caught spur, and his uneven landing make the explanation plausible. However, some historians have questioned whether the fracture occurred later when his horse fell during the escape. Modern accounts generally acknowledge both possibilities. Smithsonian's Historical Review notes that Booth's leg may have been broken either in the theater jump or in a subsequent fall from his horse. Why does this small detail matter? Because Booth was creating his own legend. He imagined himself as a heroic tyrant slayer performing before an audience. His journal was not a neutral police statement. It was the self-justification of a fugitive, desperate to control how history would remember him. Saying that he suffered the injury while leaping from the president's box made the wound part of his dramatic performance. A horse accident would be far less heroic. The uncertainty does not change Booth's guilt, but it reminds us that even assassins attempt to shape the story told about them. Dr. Charles Leal, a young Army surgeon in the audience, reached Lincoln shortly after the shooting. He located the head wound, removed a blood clot that was interfering with drainage, and restored some breathing. But Leal quickly understood that the wound was fatal. Lincoln was carried out of the theater and taken across the street to the Peterson boarding house. Because he was too tall for the bed, he was placed diagonally. Doctors gathered around him, while cabinet members, military officials, and family waited in nearby rooms. Lincoln remained unconscious for roughly 9 hours. He died at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. For many years, popular retellings concentrated on the primitive nature of Civil War medicine. Could modern surgeons have saved him? Recent neurosurgical analysis published in 2025 re-examined the historic medical accounts and wound trajectory. The study supports a bullet path concentrated on the left side of the brain, with devastating tissue damage, possible fractures at the base of the skull, and extreme pressure effects within the cranium.
The importance of this newer analysis is sobering. Lincoln did not die simply because 19th century doctors lacked modern equipment. The injury itself was catastrophic.
Even with today's trauma surgery, intensive care, and imaging technology, survival from such a wound would be extremely unlikely, and meaningful neurological recovery would be even less likely. The doctors could keep his body alive for a few hours. They could not reverse the destruction caused by the bullet. Booth did not disappear into the countryside without assistance. He fled with David Harold and traveled through Maryland toward Virginia. They stopped at Mary Surratt's tavern, where weapons and supplies had previously been stored. They visited Dr. Samuel Mudd, who treated Booth's injured leg. Mudd had met Booth before the assassination, although the full extent of his knowledge and involvement remains debated. Booth and Harold relied on guides, safe houses, and Southern sympathizers. Some helpers may not initially have known Lincoln had been murdered. Others understood that they were assisting fugitives. For 12 days, federal troops pursued Booth. The search ended at Richard Garrett's farm in Virginia, where Booth and Harold hid in a tobacco barn. Harold surrendered. Booth refused. Soldiers set the barn on fire to force him out. Sergeant Boston Corbett shot Booth through an opening, despite orders that the fugitive should ideally be captured alive. Booth died on April 26, 1865. Because he never faced trial, some of the most important questions about the wider conspiracy died with him. This is where fact and conspiracy theory often become mixed. Booth had Confederate loyalties. He worked with Confederate agents and sympathizers. His kidnapping plan developed within an environment of secret operations against the Union. But did Confederate President Jefferson Davis or senior leaders directly order Lincoln's assassination? No surviving evidence proves that they did. At the conspirators' military trial, prosecutors introduced testimony suggesting a larger Confederate plot. Some of that testimony was later discredited or viewed as unreliable. Historians continue to debate how far Booth's network extended and whether Confederate intelligence structures indirectly enabled his operations. The safest evidence-based conclusion is, Booth was not alone, and his conspiracy grew from a broader Confederate underground. However, there is no conclusive documentary proof that Jefferson Davis personally ordered Lincoln's murder. That answer is less sensational than claims of a hidden master order. It is also more truthful. The absence of conclusive evidence should not be replaced with invented certainty. Another persistent theory accuses Andrew Johnson of participating in the plot because he became president after Lincoln's death. Supporters of the theory point to Atzerott's assigned attack on Johnson and to a calling card Booth left at Johnson's hotel earlier that day. But the existence of a plot against Johnson is evidence that conspirators wanted him dead, not that he was working with them. Later congressional investigation found no reliable link showing that Johnson participated in or had advanced knowledge of Lincoln's assassination. Archival summaries note that the accumulated evidence argued against the allegation. The Booth calling card remains intriguing, but it can be explained in several ways. Booth may have been confirming Johnson's location. He may have wanted to create suspicion around the vice president. He may have intended to communicate with Johnson's staff for another purpose. What it does not provide is proof of Johnson's guilt. Mary Surratt became the first woman executed by the United States federal government. She owned the Washington boarding house where Booth and associates met, and she also owned the Maryland Tavern where weapons had been hidden. On the day of the assassination, she traveled to the tavern and delivered a message that weapons would soon be needed. The prosecution considered this evidence that she knowingly supported Booth's operation. Her defenders argued that she may have been carrying out ordinary errands without understanding the assassination plan, and that the military trial was rushed and politically charged. The military commission convicted her. She was hanged on July 7, 1865, alongside Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt. The controversy continues because the legal process was extraordinary. Civilians were tried before a military commission, while civilian courts were functioning in Washington. The proceeding admitted evidence and used procedures that would face serious constitutional challenges today. Later legal scholarship has treated the Lincoln Conspiracy Commission as deeply problematic rather than as a respected model of justice. Mary's son, John Surratt, escaped abroad. When he was later returned and tried in a civilian court, the jury failed to reach a verdict. That contrast continues to fuel arguments that Mary might not have been convicted or executed under a conventional civilian process.